Our theme for today is from lesson 27 in the workbook, Above All Else I Want to See. And as of this gathering, it's fairly close to the beginning of the year, and I know quite a number of you are in the workbook. And so I thought it would be fitting to discuss an important pattern to be aware of in the lessons that you've covered so far. If you're not in the workbook, don't worry. This pattern is very relevant for all of us as students of this path. And if you're in the workbook and you haven't noticed any patterns in the lessons, that's okay too. I didn't notice it myself until a few years ago when Robert and I were in the studio recording the audio of the workbook. But once I caught on to it, my perspective of the early lesson shifted in a pretty profound way that I hope will prove significant to you as well. Before I get into the specific pattern, though, I do want to zoom out a bit and say that for many years, I read the workbook one lesson at a time. And when you take that approach, as most of us do, it's very easy to just hone in to what that lesson is telling you to do that day and what that day's practice calls for. But when you're going through a whole series of lessons at once, as Robert and I did in the recording studio, it gives you an opportunity to really step back and take in a fuller picture of the lessons as a whole. And as we were reading these lessons for the audiobook, what I noticed is that the workbook has a lot of what I call theme clusters in it, meaning it has clusters of lessons that are reinforcing the same theme. If you're reading the workbook on a calendar year schedule, this is the case in the lessons that you've just covered, lessons 42 to 47, where the idea that God is repeated over a succession of days. God is my strength, God is my source, God is the light, God is the love, etc. There's also a cluster coming up in lessons 98 to 100 that talk about our function. There's a lot of little forgiveness clusters scattered throughout the workbook and so on. But the largest cluster of lessons by far occurs at the very beginning of the workbook and relates to the idea of sight. So the pattern that we need to be aware of is the many early workbook lessons emphasize the value and the goal for us in seeing things a certain way. He starts right out of the gate with lesson 1, nothing I see means anything. He continues with lesson 2, I have given everything I see all the meaning it has for me. Lesson 3, I do not understand anything I see. Lesson 7, I see only the past. Lesson 9, I see nothing as it is now. And it goes on and on and on. Again, if you're just taking each lesson day by day, you might not notice, but of the first 50 lessons in the workbook, 21 of them actually have the word see in the title, and one has looking, which in this case means the exact same thing. And so what this means is that of the first 50 lessons in the workbook of A Course in Miracles, essentially half of them are about transforming how we see things. And once you notice this idea, you start to see its fingerprints everywhere. So, for example, in the introduction to the workbook, the Course says, quote, "The purpose of the workbook is to train the mind in a systematic way to a different perception of everything in the world." The workbook is divided into 2 sections. The first dealing with undoing the way you see now, and the second with the restoration of sight. As so many of us do, and I certainly did this in my early years with the Course, it's easy to go through the workbook and just have this generic picture of what it's asking us to do and where it's leading us. When in fact, the Course itself has a very specific picture of what's happening here. So in the workbook, we are, as I just read, training the mind in a careful and methodical way to embrace a different perception of everything by undoing the way we see now and restoring our spiritual sight. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. How are we training the mind in the course? What's the picture that he wants us to embrace? What does it mean to undo the way we see now? And what does it mean to restore our spiritual sight? Because if we can do these things, then we can unlock the promise that the Course holds out to us, the promise that we can have inner peace, the promise that we can have freedom from our grievances, the promise that we can have relationships that are far more loving, the promise that we can hear guidance from the Holy Spirit more clearly, that we can get home faster, all of it. And so that's why we're on the spiritual journey, isn't it? And his roadmap for getting there is right in the introduction to the workbook. So I'm just going to go through that introduction piece by piece, starting with how are we training the mind in the course? Now, mind training is one of those things that we hear and we tend to get a little spooked. For one, we don't love discipline because it feels like work, and it is. And second, we've become very comfortable with the thought patterns and the habits that we've developed over time. We like clinging to our ego, even though we know deep down it's not really serving us. In lesson 20 of the workbook, I am determined to see, Jesus tells us point blank the price that we're paying for this. He says, this, meaning this lesson, is our first attempt to introduce structure. So up until this point in the workbook, there really hasn't been a lot asked of us. He goes on to say, do not misconstrue it as an effort to exert force or pressure. So here he's speaking to our fear of control. He says, you want salvation, you want happiness, you want peace. You do not have them now because your mind is totally undisciplined. And it's interesting that Jesus never demands in the course. He actively warns against that. Instead, what he's always trying to do is to reason us into why we want to change for our own good. As an example, he told course scribe Helen Schuckman early in the process of the course coming through that he wasn't angry when she kept rejecting him. He was just sorry that she suffered so much for no reason. And it's the same thing here in lesson 20. He's saying you want salvation, you want happiness, you want peace, but you don't have those things because your mind is out of control. This is the problem that all of those endless repetitions of lines in the workbook is meant to solve. Every time you repeat an idea for the day, as we like to say around here, it's like a bicep curl. Instead of becoming physically stronger, you are becoming spiritually stronger. We know that we can't just do one bicep curl and think that we're going to be strong enough to do pull-ups. I'm thinking about pull-ups specifically because Robert and I have this wooden beam across the bedroom in our place in England. And in the mornings when Robert's son Michael's there, he'll come like rushing into the room and like jump up on the beam and do chin-ups on the beam. Now, Robert's son is on a basketball team, so he can jump and he works out every day, so he can do these pull-ups. I can't do pull-ups because I just don't put in that kind of time. So we know we have to do many reps over many months to do something that's physically hard. Michael works out pretty much every day. And the course knows that we have to do spiritual reps over many months to do something that is spiritually hard. To forgive when you feel betrayed is hard. It is a heavy spiritual lift. We don't just come out of the womb knowing how to do that. And moreover, we live in a world that actively conditions us every day to do the opposite. To have a spiritually disciplined mind takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of reps. But if we don't do the work, then what do we have? We have an undisciplined mind filled with ego thoughts, and we can't see clearly. We have a mind that is so cluttered with the ego, the workbook says we become, quote, deaf to reason, sanity, and simple truth. So, in other words, if we don't do the work, we have a mind that sees guilt and blame where we should see love. We have a mind that sees judgment and grievance where we should see peace. We have a mind that allows our anger to take over and create tremendous amounts of friction in our lives that can be very, very hard to clean up. And all of this is suffering. We know it. And it all comes from the way we quote unquote see with our very undisciplined way of seeing. So then the question becomes, how would the Course have us see? If we're training our mind to embrace a different perception of everything, then what is that perception the Course wants us to have? If you've been with us for a while, you probably know the answer to that question. At the end of the day, the Course is leading us to what it calls vision. And when we say see with vision, this isn't something that happens with our physical sight. It's an inner knowing. The Course is leading us to a place of inner knowing of what is ultimately true, based not on physical sight, but on spiritual sight. The Course says vision, quote, beholds a light beyond the body, an idea beyond what can be touched, a purity undimmed by errors. And this is what all of our study and our practice in the Course is leading us to. Every exercise rep, every repetition of the idea for the day is an attempt to get us closer to the goal of seeing beyond the forms of this world to the holiness in all things. It's leading us to a place where we have a disciplined mind that, from a Course's view, is able to see with pure love. That's what discipline is in the Course. We have a mind that's able to look out at the world and look out at other people and see without judgment and without fear, to recognize the sacredness of all life and our interconnectedness with it. This is the picture that we are being asked to embrace in the Course, a world where all things shine with holiness, beauty, and infinite worth. And we need this picture. We need this picture because, again, left to our own devices, we don't see clearly. We can't. Our egos just snake around our perception and choke it until all we see is distorted. And then we wonder why we're so confused, why we're so angry, why we're so judgmental, and why we suffer so much. I'm sure we can all think of situations in our lives where we were so convinced at the time that we saw things with perfect clarity. And then we look back on that time and we're just stunned at how wrong we were. We thought we were seeing clearly when really it was just those same old ego distortions that clutter up the mind and make it deaf to reason, sanity, and simple truth. There's a million examples of this going on all the time, everywhere, every day. But one that stands out to me because of its extreme nature is Robert and I watched a documentary on January 6th where this man very violently stormed the US Capitol because, in his own words, 800,000 children are kidnapped every year in the United States, and he wanted to do something about it. Now, I know there are children who are kidnapped, and that's obviously a very serious thing. But 800,000 children divided by 365 days in the year, would mean that in order for him to be right, just under 2,200 children would be disappearing from homes and streets and schools every single day in the US alone. And if that were happening, it would be a huge national crisis. We would have thousands of parents on the news every day looking for their kids. So 30 seconds of critical thinking and basic math should have been enough for this guy to know that his thinking was insane. But that's what the ego does. No matter how insane our thinking becomes, the ego makes us feel that we are absolutely convinced that we have it right and that everyone else has it wrong. And that is the hallmark of how you know you're in ego thinking. When you are completely right, you are completely honest, your motives are completely pure, while everyone else is totally wrong. They've got motives that are totally dishonest and corrupt. The guy from the documentary, as I mentioned, is an extreme example. But if we are being honest with ourselves, we can see this kind of thinking. We can see shades of it in our own lives all the time. So think for a moment of someone that you don't like, someone who has hurt you, someone who is in the way of something that you want. And if you get in touch with that feeling of dislike towards this person, you can see how easy it is for our minds to become warped. When we really don't like someone, it's almost impossible for us to be fair to them in our thinking. We overlook the good in them and we exaggerate their flaws. If they do something kind or helpful, it's almost like those actions don't even register. But if they do something unkind, oh, just watch how fast those ego hunting dogs are all over it, looking to bring back any shred of guilt from them to our mind. And it's the strangest thing that we cling to this so much because it is so willfully suicidal. We can lose friends, we can lose family, we can lose careers and opportunities, and we're willing to do all of that, all of it, because our ego has convinced us that we're the righteous ones. We're the ones standing for values. We're the ones who see what's really going on. And oftentimes, we are just as crazy as that guy who thinks he's saving 800,000 non-existent kids. That's the lengths we will go to hold on to our insane perceptions. And that's why the Course wants us to undo the way we see now. It's a huge step towards healing, huge step to admit that we don't see clearly. Because if we can admit that our minds are undisciplined and our minds are actually a bit out of control, then we would be more willing to do, as the workbook says, what we need to do to undo the way we see now and restore our spiritual sight. And so this leads us to the question of what is it that we can do about our perception? The Course thinks that the situation in our minds is so dire that it not only says we're deaf, I just mentioned it says we're deaf to reason, sanity, and simple truth, but it also repeatedly says that we're blind. The Course says that like someone who can't see, we, quote, stumble and fall down upon the stones that we don't recognize and fail to be aware that we can go through the doors we thought were closed. And isn't that exactly how we go through life? So many of us are constantly stumbling around with this book and this path and that path and this teacher and that teacher. And each one feels like the answer for a moment, but then no real progress is made. We're blindly searching for truth. And when we are blindly searching for truth, it just always feels a bit beyond our reach. But the Course says that's not the case. The Course says those doors are not closed. We have all that we need to train our mind to embrace a different perception of everything. All we have to do is undo the way we see now and restore our spiritual sight. And on this final point, the Course uses restoration of spiritual sight on purpose. It's not saying undo your perception and replace it with sight. It's saying undo your perception and restore the sight that's in you already. It's just covered up with the way you see now. Vision already lives in us. We just need to use it. And the way we do that is, as these early lessons tell us, we become determined to see. To be determined to see means to make a firm decision and to be resolved not to change that decision. So we first need to make a firm decision that we are going to see the holiness in all things. And that vision is going to be non-negotiable to us. In chapter 4 of the text, in a beautiful passage, Jesus says, "Your mind and mine can unite in shining your ego away and releasing the strength and beauty of God into everything you think and will and do." And here's the important part. Do not settle for anything less than this and refuse to accept anything but this as your goal. Watch your mind carefully for any beliefs that hinder its accomplishment and step away from them. So, are we saying to ourselves each day, I have firmly decided that I am not settling for those old egoic patterns and the way I see now? Are we saying to ourselves each day, I refuse to accept anything but true vision as my goal? If we could do that, it would be, as the Course says, a gateway to vision. This is what opens the doorway that we thought was closed. And yes, I'm sorry to say, it takes practice. It is no accident that lesson 20 is about being determined to see. And that is the first lesson in the workbook that asks us to do frequent structured practice. It's in lesson 20 that he asks us to practice every half hour by repeating the phrase, I am determined to see. And while we repeat that line, he wants us to say it not in a rote way or in a way where we're just phoning it in, but we say it with conviction. He says, say it as if you're determined to change your present state for a better one, that better state that you really want. The Course says that's all it takes. That's all it takes, to be repeatedly focused on our desire to see. And lesson 20 says, what you desire, you will see. Such is the real law of cause and effect as it operates in this world. So to acquire vision, we just need to keep exercising that desire to see. We just need to keep wanting to change our current state for a better one. And we can tell Jesus is serious about this because 7 lessons later, he steps it up. So in lesson 27, which is where this gathering gets its name, he says, above all else, I want to see. That's the lesson title. And that lesson begins, today's idea expresses something stronger than mere determination. It gives vision top priority among your desires. So he goes from asking us to be determined to have vision to making it our number one desire. And then, because he knows us, he gets a little sneaky when he connects how often we remember to repeat the idea, above all else I want to see, with how much we actually want that to be our top priority. So he says the real question is, how often will you remember? How much do you want today's idea to be true? Answer one of these questions and you've answered the other one. So in other words, if you want the idea to be true, you will remember and vision will be yours. Whenever I think about this idea, I think about an experience that I had in meditation a few years ago that wasn't all that grand or sophisticated, but it was very powerful. It has never left me. Because in that meditation, there was this strong sense that we all have a choice between two levels in which to place our focus. There's the lower level, which is the self, what we do and how we feel about anything and everything at any given time. This level is the churn, or I'm calling it the churn. And in the meditation, it was clear that the churn tends to be our default mode most of the time. There was a sense that we spend our days consumed with the churn, and none of that really matters in the end. And then above the churn, there was a higher level. It was the level of God. And what came into my mind in the meditation was that we have to, again, make a definitive choice between the crashing mental waves of the churn that can consume us all day long, or the larger, universally calm presence of God. And I got the sense that if we center our attention on God, meaning if we put love and truth first, then the pain and chaos of the churn just sorts itself out. But the opposite isn't true. If we center our attention on the churn, it's difficult, if not impossible, to find God. And there was a real feeling of determination and choosing God over the inherent pull of the churn. The image that came to my mind was that of a monk or the priestess in the Course. If you're familiar with the story of the priestess, she doesn't pray when she feels like it. She prays because she has dedicated her life to prayer. She's devoted to God, and her prayers are an extension of his love to other people. We can make that same choice, and we're meant to. Do we want to make our lives about getting caught in that churn of the self and all of our lower level, baser concerns? Or do we want to make our lives about that desire to truly see? And again, we need that desire. We have to find that desire in us. It takes a lot of determination to open those spiritual eyes that we all have that have been shut for so long that they are probably crusted over. But we can do that if, above all else, we want to see. If we want to see above all else, above the churn, above all of those self-concerns, then we will have the kind of vision the Course promises. We can look out into the world and we will see the holiness of all things, but that determination is key. We need that determination to not give up by thinking we can't get to the goal of vision, by thinking that door is closed. We need that determination to not argue with the plan of forgiveness because really we just don't want to forgive. We need that determination to not stay stuck in our endless search for answers because we lack the discipline to commit to the answer that is right in front of us. Lesson 20 says, in your determination to see is vision given you. So let us be determined to see. Let us be determined to really see, day in, day out, arising with that determination and desire in the morning, exercising that determination and desire throughout every interaction that we have all day with everyone we meet, bringing that desire and that determination to see with us even as we go to sleep at night. If we can do that, we will have the goal of the course. And what a relief it will be to let go of that churn, to let go of that constant insecurity of what do I do in this moment? Because when we have that determination to see, that's all we need to ask ourselves is not what do I need to do in this moment, but how do I need to see in this moment and be determined to see with vision? Because it's from the determination to see that you will automatically know what to do. Thank you.